and it really singles out this particular technology, genetic engineering, for mandatory process-based labelling. And consumers, if you ask them, are interested in a lot of different processes, and if you put to them, would you like to see food labelled that's been sprayed with pesticides, they'll say yes. I saw a poll the other day that said the majority of consumers think that food should be labelled as to whether the animals were handled in a humane fashion or not. And so I think there are many different processes that different consumers are interested in, and different segments of the population may be interested in different processes. And mandating process-based labelling is really quite a complex topic with nuanced marketing, economic, legal and trade implications depending on how the law is written and perhaps more importantly how the marketplace responds to that law getting passed. So I'll move a little bit into the science, and many of the state labelling initiatives in the preamble that preludes the law itself suggest there's still remaining food safety concerns associated with this food. And I think that as a scientist, I just think the scientific consensus on this particular issue is very strong, and that is that there hasn't been any unique hazards associated with foods produced using genetic engineering, and there's really a very robust worldwide literature by independent experts throughout the world that have done hundreds of studies that haven't found a safety concern with foods produced using this particular technology. And I think, you'll hear about one study that'll get trotted out and 600 will be ignored whilst looking at this one study. And as a scientist, when you've got a topic where there's some indecision, I think that the voices of our scientific societies that represent caste are really where you go to look for what the scientific consensus on a topic is. And if you look at the AAAS, you look at the US National Academy of Sciences, our premier National Society of Science, the American Medical Association, even the European Commission, which has typically been no friend to genetic engineering, the scientific consensus is that these products do not pose a safety risk. And so I think that is really not what this labelling initiative is about, because the scientific consensus is very solid on this particular topic. With regards to food labelling, that is typically a duty that's fallen to the FDA under the Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act. And typically food labelling is required when the food has something in it, something about that food poses some sort of a danger to certain consumers. For example, a peanut allergen, you would want to label it with might contain peanuts, or it has a composition that you wouldn't expect in that particular food. So if you've got a product that has very high levels of certain fatty acids that's not typically found in that particular product, you might have a label on it to alert consumers to the fact this is not what you might be expecting. But historically, there hasn't been the requirement for labelling of processes used to produce food that's compositionally identical to food that hasn't been produced using that particular process. And that's really been a pretty standard comment from the FDA in that regard. And all the products that are currently in the market, the genetically engineered crops that have been commercialised, have been through regulatory evaluation, and it's a very long and expensive process in the millions of dollars, which is actually at some levels stymieing the development of a number of other new and different crops, and it really kind of to some extent makes it the purview of very large companies to get these products to market because it is a very expensive regulatory process. However, they have all been through FDA review for safety, and there's sometimes on the internet you'll see that they're not regulated at all by the FDA, and they have all been through regulatory review. And the FDA has stated no basis for finding that genetically engineered foods differ from other foods in any meaningful or uniform way, or that as a class they present any different or greater safety concern than foods developed by conventional breeding. That's the FDA's statement. Consequently, they don't mandate process-based labelling. However, they do allow voluntary process-based labelling, and in 2001 they came out with guidelines for industry as to what that might look like. And I just want to talk about the fact that we have a number of process-based labels in our food supply, and this is just a very small sampling of different processes that different consumers are interested in purchasing. Maybe certified humane, never over 3 is a meat one, cage-free, kosher, grass-fed. There's all these different processes, and the way that the marketplace has dealt with that is to make that available as a value-added process-based label in a voluntary way. And for example, with regards to genetic engineering, the non-GMO project is a project that verifies products don't contain genetically engineered ingredients above 0.9%, and they have 14,800 food products and 800 brands certified as meeting the certifications of that particular project. So that choice is available in the marketplace. And so once we start mandating that these process-based labels have to be put on food, then we start running into some of the legal and economic issues that I'll discuss next. And given we've got Tom here, I'm going to just briefly touch on the 3 main legal issues that are likely to be triggered if we have state-based labelling of genetically engineered foods that are no different to conventional foods. One is the Commerce Clause of the US Constitution, which forbids individual states from unduly burdening US commerce. The second is the Supremacy Clause of the US Constitution, which more or less prevails, federal law prevails in any conflict with state law. And as I mentioned earlier, the FDA has said that process-based labels are not required for the products of genetic engineering, and a state-based law mandating that they have to be on there would be in conflict with that particular federal law. And finally, the First Amendment protection of commercial speech, which prohibits government compulsion of commercial speech unless the speech is factual, uncontroversial, and reasonably related to a legitimate government interest. And this particular principle was brought into play when there was a proposed labelling for milk from animals that had been treated with recombinant bovine somatotropin back in, I believe it was 1996 in Vermont. And in fact, the court overturned that mandatory labelling because they deemed that consumer curiosity alone was insufficient to mandate a label when there was no food safety concern involved, and that didn't constitute a legitimate government interest. And so there is some precedent for that particular one coming into play. Another option would be to move to a national GE labelling law, such that there isn't state-by-state meshwork, but rather a national law where all products are labelled. And if that was to happen, the US would have to show that there's some scientific health threat in order to be in compliance with international trade law, because the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement of the WTO frowns on process-based labelling, mandating disclosure of information on production processes that do not themselves relate to food safety. And in fact, we've run afoul of a couple of WTO decisions in recent times, dolphin safe and cool labelling, where the laws were designed to inform consumers about a process that was not impacting the food product itself. And then finally we come to the economic issues, and I think there's a myriad of economic issues, and it's very hard for me to succinctly put these into a short presentation, but I'll do my best to address them, because I really think this is where the rubber meets the road. And so, as I mentioned, there are non-GE and organic options. Of course, organic is a process-based labelling that doesn't allow the use of genetically engineered crops and animals in its particular production process certification. And that provides interested consumers with information and choices, but they tend to be more costly than conventional foods. And one of the important things with regards to the incremental costs associated with those particular products is a very important issue related to the tolerance for genetically engineered products that these products allow. And when I say tolerance, what I'm talking about here is adventitious presence or low levels of genetically engineered products that might be present in something that's saying it's not genetically engineered. And this is, if you look at other countries that have mandatory GE labelling, there's anywhere from 1 to 5% is kind of the allowable tolerance for a certain level of low-level presence of genetically engineered products in there. And basically, the lower you go on the level that you'll tolerate in a product, the more expensive it gets to source pure enough ingredients to get into that product, and the more risk that you're exposed to for mislabeling, because you might have a positive test that comes out from those products. But the real costs of mandatory GE labels, I think, is really where, if you read the scientific literature, there's all sorts of estimates. It's, you know, I've sat on a panel with someone who said it was going to for sure be 57 cents per person. And then I've been on other panels where, you know, it's going to be $200 or $300 per family per year. And I think really we don't know. And part of the reason we don't know is that cost is really going to depend on how the market responds once it's in place. And the reason for that is that in order to work out what those added costs might be, it's really going to depend on the estimation of the proportion of the market that's going to shift their ingredients to non-genetically engineered products in order to avoid having to label, and then sourcing those products and reformulating those products. If that happens on a big level, such as it happened in Europe when they introduced labelling, there was labelling came in, there was a lot of protests and boycotting of particular products. Those companies took those products off the shelf and reformulated them to have non-genetically engineered ingredients. And that, if it was to happen in the US, where we have such a large use of this technology in agriculture, would be a potentially very costly proposition when we're looking at food costs in the United States. Some of the other things that come into play with regards to the economic issues is the potential changes in the costs of mandatory labelling, and in fact the Vermont bill has this particular clause in it, which seemed to originate in the California Proposition 37 language. I'm not exactly sure why July the 1st of 2019 was selected as the day, but up until that point, food products containing 0.9% or less of genetically engineered ingredients are exempt from labelling. But then it's really not clear to me what happens on July the 2nd of 2019. And I think it may be that at that stage, any level of content has to be labelled, which to me is kind of implementing a zero tolerance. And as I mentioned earlier, a zero tolerance is going to be commercially inviable to achieve, given the widespread use of the technology in American agriculture, and also opens up companies to liability issues if they have a positive test come back on a product that doesn't carry a label, and that potentially might get sued for that. And so it's a bit unclear in that regard. Another factor that will impact cost is what's exempted from these regulations. At the current time, most of them exempt milk, meat and eggs from animals that have eaten genetically engineered feed. And as an animal scientist, I can tell you that is a very large proportion and a very large category, and it will be very hard to track those animals and whether they've eaten that feed or not. If that is covered, that would really add a new level of cost, especially since you can't trace it in the milk, meat or eggs. Alcohol is currently exempted, restaurant meals, meals eaten out of the home are currently exempted, and organic food. And depending which of those are in or out will have different cost implications. And then finally, there's the question of who pays. And given the proposed rules and exemptions, more affluent families tend to spend a lesser proportion of their general overall income on food. They also tend to spend more on food away from the home and organics, and they would most likely be the least impacted by any food increases that result from labelling. And the incremental costs of any mandatory GE labelling would likely extract a greater income on greater effect on low-income families, just because low-income families proportionally spend more of their income on food and tend to eat more food that's prepared at home and bought at supermarkets. So in summary, all domesticated crops and animals have been genetically modified in some way, and there's no science-based reason to single out this particular way of genetically modifying, that is genetic engineering, for mandatory process-based labelling, when wide-ranging evidence shows that the technology is equally safe to conventional breeding. Mandatory labelling based on process really abandons the traditional US practice of providing for consumer food preferences as it relates to process through voluntary labelling and product differentiation. And these measures currently provide choice in the marketplace for all number of consumer interests with regards to different processes used in food production. Current labelling authority is federal to the FDA, and state mandatory laws are likely to run into legal complications for conflicting the federal authority and First Amendment rights. It has national trade implications if a national labelling initiative was to come into play in our food. It would increase food costs. How much, I think, is hard to predict, and I don't think anybody knows. And I think the size of this increase will very much depend on choices made in the marketplace by suppliers and marketers, and what products are included in the labelling requirements. And I would argue, most importantly, the tolerance threshold that's put into place in any laws that come onto the market. The lower that threshold, the more expensive it's going to be to comply with it. If, as in other countries, sellers move to non-GE offerings in response to mandatory labelling, it is possible that food costs could rise significantly, and these increased costs would exact a greater burden on low-income families. However, on the other hand, if food suppliers just decide to put a label on everything, without any testing or segregation costs, then the increase in food costs would be minimal. And so, with that, I'll finish my presentation and we'll move to the next discussion session here.